So let's say you had a friend back home, might have been a junior or something when you were a senior, and he or she was wanting to go to college, but they didn't really even know how to get started. How would you start to help them out?
So the first thing I'd say is don't panic. When you're a junior or sophomore or whatever, you still have plenty of time to figure out what you want in your school and what's the best fit for you. And so I'd say find people that you're comfortable talking to about this process that have been through it just like you have, because so many people have been through the process and have lots of advice to give. And I'd say that's a first step. And then moving on to actually discovering and finding schools, I'd just look into yourself and understand what is most important to you and what has been most important to you in the past. So in your school, was it a small community that you really enjoyed, or do you want this huge school that you can meet tons of people? Do you crave to be on an athletic team, or do you want to focus more on the academic side, and do you know specifically what your major wants to be? There are a lot of things that you can look for, but I'd say focus on like 5 things that are most important to you. And I think one of those, one of the most important is the financial aspect. Some schools tend to be really expensive, and those happen to be private schools. So public state schools tend to be a lot cheaper, and so planning to stay home or closer to home might be beneficial in that sense. But some private schools also have lots of money that they give to students in terms of scholarships. So you really just have to find that balance, what's right for you and what you want.
Awesome advice. And there are a lot of resources out there. Lots of people have been through this before.
Mm-hmm.
How about, what do you think they need to know about the application process?
So I'd say one of the most important parts about the application process is understanding when the deadlines are. So really planning ahead and making sure you get things out of the way before they're due. The worst thing you want to do for yourself is wait to the last minute. Maybe you can do it with schoolwork, but in terms of college applications, there's no makeup. You can't miss the deadline and then plan to apply the next day. So I'd say that that's very important. Most schools have different application dates, so you'll want to maybe make a calendar, make a list of the different deadlines and use that to your advantage. And then another important thing in terms of the application process is that some schools have additional requirements. So that could be in terms of supplemental writings. Other than just the Common App, you'll have to do an extra writing portion, or you'll have to take a different test, like the SAT subject tests. And these can be really stressful when students don't know about them before the deadline, which is, it could be as soon as a week, and that's just really not enough time to get them done. So I'd say if you're interested in specific schools and you don't know what their requirements are, look into each school's requirements.
What about early admissions? How does that work?
Right. So some schools offer early admissions in terms of early action, early decision, or just regular decision. So early action is not binding. If you're accepted through early action, you're not required to go to the school. But early decision, on the other hand, while it can increase your chances of getting into the school, which is one benefit, it is binding. So if you get accepted, you have to go to that school. So that's really reserved for the schools that are most important to you. And in terms of early decision, you can only apply to one school through early decision because it's binding. So I chose to actually do early decision in my application process because I knew that for my school, it increased my chances of getting in significantly. And because I wanted to go to this school so bad, I chose to do that. And I weighed the negatives against the positives. If you know that the school doesn't offer you too much financial aid, I would probably not do early decision, but I lucked out and I got financial aid to support my journey in coming to the school. So,
how do you recommend, or how would you encourage folks that are applying to get their references? Like, who should they ask? Who's a good idea and why, or whatever?
Yeah, so most schools require at least one recommendation, and those are mostly in the form of an academic recommendation. So a high school teacher or professor that you had during your 4 years. And so I would really encourage students to find people that they've connected with throughout their journey, that have seen them struggle, have seen them grow as a person, have seen them, despite the fact that they weren't very good in a subject, improve tremendously. And even if you feel you don't have those people, eventually they'll come naturally. At the beginning of my application process, I felt, oh, I'm never gonna get a connection with a teacher that is powerful enough to get me into a school. And over the past 4 years, I've gained enough recommenders that I didn't know what to do with. I didn't know who to ask. So I'd say it comes naturally, so don't worry. And second of all, don't be afraid to ask, because most of the time they'll be excited to do it for you. They'll be flattered even. And so that's really what their job is. So don't be afraid to ask teachers for recommendations. And then outside of teachers, some schools will also accept recommendations from religious mentors, athletic coaches, volunteer mentors, all these different groups. So really anywhere that you can have someone saying tremendous things about you is what you want.
How about like how to navigate the FAFSA process?
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? That's kind of intimidating. And
Yeah, absolutely. The FAFSA process was very stressful for me because I decided, as I would not recommend to do, to wait to the last minute. So I was trying to put in the FAFSA on the very day that it was due for my school. And that was a horrifying process because I had to get all of this information from the tax returns and from these different places. That made it really stressful. So the first tip is do not wait till the last minute when it comes to financial aid and filing for FAFSA, because it just causes more stress than necessary. And in terms of how to fill that out, it can be very, very tough when you're doing it alone. And so I would ask guidance counselors, teachers, and your parents, of course, to help you with that process. And if your parents don't have time, there are other programs usually offered through your school or through, again, those guidance counselors and support systems that you have that will usually always be willing to help. And in terms of when the FAFSA application opens up, that would be October 1st. And I think that's every year. So if you want to plan ahead, I would start as soon as possible.
And it comes around every year. I always remember people scrambling in like February and March. Is that because they waited to the end? And,
yeah.
And does the money get handed out to the first people?
So it depends on your school. In the application process, you want to apply for FAFSA before you get your application in, because they eventually, for a lot of schools, the money runs out. And so they only have so much money to give. And some schools even require a very specific deadline. Some schools don't, and you don't want to wait to the last minute, because even if there is no deadline, you could be losing opportunity to get extra financial aid. But some schools do have a deadline because they want to give everyone a fair opportunity to get that financial aid. So really pay attention to those deadlines. And then another important piece of information, and this is something you really shouldn't be worrying about in your application process, but every year you have to reapply for the financial aid, but it should get progressively easier once you've done it a couple of times.
And it's something that can be done completely online.
Yeah.
Great. Do you think it's necessary for people to have to visit colleges first before going?
So I ended up visiting about half the schools I applied to, because most of them were in the eastern area, so the East Coast, the Northeast. And so if you have the opportunity to view them, I would certainly take a look at the schools, because they can make or break your decision about whether you think it's the right choice for you. For example, I went all the way to Pennsylvania. I think it was a 4-hour drive to a school, and immediately once I got there, I just realized it wasn't for me. There were too many people. The school didn't seem like it was in the right atmosphere. The city wasn't the best fit for me. So all of those things can combine and make you realize just how not perfect the school is for you, even if you think it's the best choice. And so I would definitely take a look if you have the opportunity. But then on the other hand, I never got a chance to tour my school that I'm at now because it's all the way across the country. I didn't have the resources or the people to take me to Colorado, but there are virtual tours that you can do online. So I would certainly make sure that you take advantage of those opportunities, because those can provide just as much support.
How many schools should somebody apply to, you think, is a reasonable amount or a safe bet, or how do you figure that one out?
So I remember talking to my guidance counselor and telling her I was going to apply to 15 schools because I couldn't decide which ones I wanted to apply to. And she told me no, I was ridiculous. I would kill myself if I tried to apply to 15 schools. And she was absolutely right. 10 schools was enough for me. So I'd say like a range of 5 to 10. 10 is pushing it. Some people I know apply to like 20 or more, but I think if you're doing supplemental writings, which are, again, those additional additional requirements that some schools have, it can be really difficult to get all of those in on time and to put the right amount of effort into those. So I would strike a balance between 5 and 10 and try not to go over that. But if there's one more school, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. And then on top of that, when it comes to applying to different types of schools, ooh, I lost my train of thought, but maybe I'll get back to you if I remember what I was going to say.
No worries. And I would imagine too, if somebody's really sure, they could even get away with probably 3 colleges applying. Like if they have a really secure safety net and they're really dead set on a couple opportunities, that they could go on the shorter end of things maybe.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to talk about. So depending on the schools, there tend to be like a safety school, a reach school, and a target school. So I would try and have a good balance between schools that you can be relatively sure that you'd be able to get into, schools that, you know, they're the right fit, you think you can get in, you're not entirely sure, but you're pretty confident, and then schools that are a reach, so you have to try really hard to get in there. You're not sure. Harvard is a good example. A lot of those Ivy Leagues, those really low percentage acceptance rates, those schools would be reach schools. And a lot of people don't get into those schools. And when it comes to reach schools, I wouldn't get your hopes up. I think it's a good idea to try and include a school that you're really excited about going to, but I wouldn't say that it's the end of things if you don't get into your dream school.
That sounds like that question we talked about earlier about like, what do you do when you're not getting into your top choice and you're just given a little bit of a reality check that it's okay to dream and shoot for it, but so few kids get into those high Ivy Leagues like Harvard and Yale, that just being prepared for that and not letting yourself down about it. You know, the fact that you're even putting an application in is amazing. Really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know people that have been devastated over the fact that they didn't get into their dream schools. And that's absolutely not what you want to get out of college, because you can have just as good of an experience as it's at a state school than at a private school. You're going to make great friends, learn amazing things at either place. So it really just depends on, you know, what school you think is right for you.
Yeah, and go on with the right attitude, like, hey, this is going to be a great experience. I'm totally charged up for it.
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Exactly.
Where do they inquire about scholarships if they're looking?
Right. So there are tons of resources online that can help you look for easy or fast scholarships. And I say that those ones are really more of a gamble. They're kind of like a lottery. You can apply for them, but because so many people have access to those scholarships, there's a lot less likelihood of a chance for you getting the scholarships. So I would say instead of looking online at these giant resources, I would ask people that you know, people in your school, about local scholarships. And you can find those scholarships online too. Maybe do like a quick search of your town or your state and the scholarship name. And that'll increase your chances of getting them because they're a lot more local. And so you don't have to compete with this giant application pool for this one scholarship. You can just compete amongst a couple of people that know about that scholarship and are applying there. So I think all of the scholarships that I got were through more local areas. And then when it comes to your school, some schools offer specific scholarships. So for example, in the National Honor Society that was at my school, they had a $100,000 scholarship, which is amazing, that they give out every single year to one of the top students at the school that's in the National Honor Society. And that's an example of a more selective scholarship, but there are tons of scholarships. There are athletic scholarships, there are volunteering scholarships. So whatever you dip your feet into, you'll have the opportunity to get something.
Yeah, and I've even heard of things like if your parents are union members, there's union scholarships that you could be, you know, that you could apply for. There's state of Connecticut, certain it wouldn't surprise me too if there's like foster family type scholarship opportunity as well.
I know a friend who has the opportunity to, because he was involved in the Department of Children and Families, or DCF, he was able to get his entire college paid for in the state of Connecticut. So if you are involved in DCF and you plan on going to a school in Connecticut and you're currently involved with them, then you'll likely be able to have access to that scholarship, which is a really great opportunity to get a college education for virtually no amount of money, no cost.
Yeah, and that's what you'd work with your social worker on and check into that. But that's my understanding is Connecticut's pretty magical that way. They offer young people in the state that are part of DCF an avenue to get to college. So there's some requirements, so you have to check into what those mean and so forth. But I think it's nice that you know somebody that's happened for, because I think it's great. I've met many students who have went that route. Is there anything that you would do differently in your whole application process?
I'd say really the one thing is don't stress out too much, because in the very beginning, or at least like very early on, since sophomore year, I was very worried that I wouldn't get into a school, and I was stressed about which school to choose. But I'd say just go with the flow. Don't spend too much time thinking about it, because that takes the fun out of your high school experience, which is supposed to be just as valuable as your college experience. So I'd say don't stress out too much. Just, again, go with the flow, find what works for you, and try not to push yourself too hard, because really high school shouldn't be about pushing yourself too hard. And on the opposite end, don't be too hard on yourself if you're not pushing yourself hard enough. Do what you can, find a balance.
Is there anything else you might like to say or add that might help somebody's college experience be smooth and successful?
Yeah, so in terms of just applying to college, I'd say a lot of people have the misconception that you need perfect grades or a whole bunch of extracurriculars to get into the school that they want to get into, but that's the opposite of what schools are looking for. They really want to find passionate individuals who have one or two really core interests and who can talk about that very intently. And so I'd say both in your writing for your Common App, but also in the activities that you put on your application, make that shine. Make sure that they can see who you are without you, going individually to meet them. And though you can do interviews with schools, those aren't really necessary. Really, what's more important is for you to express yourself through your application process. Once you're actually in the school, I'd say keep an open mind, because people, or at least for me, I got my hopes up very, very much. So I was thinking that this school was perfect for me. There would be nothing wrong with it. Everyone would be amazing. But of course, you're not going to find any school that's like that, because it's impossible. There's no school like that. Nobody will be perfect. Nobody will do everything that you imagine. And that's just a part of the learning curve. And so really paying attention to that and understanding that you have to really flow with the tides and take things as they come and go is pretty valuable and pretty important.
Well, great, Brigitte. Thank you so much. Is there anything you feel like you need to say?
I think that's it. Just be excited about the process, be excited, and work hard to get there.